The United States government once spent taxpayer money to compile 17,000 pages of surveillance files on a single man. Buried in those pages was a warning so unusual it read less like a threat assessment and more like a book review. The FBI called him extremely eloquent, and therefore extremely dangerous. Not dangerous because he carried a weapon, not dangerous because he commanded an army. Dangerous because when he opened his mouth, people who had been silent for centuries suddenly remembered how to speak. On February 11, 1979, that man stood on the steps of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., struck a match, and burned an American flag in broad daylight, while federal agents watched from behind bulletproof glass. 12 hours later, a fire of suspicious origin tore through a home on a remote Nevada reservation. When the flames died, his pregnant wife, his 3 small children, and his mother-in-law were all dead. The government ruled it an accident. He called it murder. And what he did next would transform him from a political radical into one of the most acclaimed poets and musicians in America, championed by Bob Dylan, Robert Redford, and Angelina Jolie. A man who traded his fury for verses and somehow became more dangerous with a pen than he had ever been with a megaphone. His name was John Trudell, and this is the story that the history books left out. Number 1. Born between two worlds. John Trudell came into the world on February 15, 1946, in Omaha, Nebraska, born to a father who was Santee Dakota Sioux and a mother of Mexican and indigenous Mexican heritage. From his very first breath, he existed between worlds, not fully belonging to either. The family scraped by in small towns near the Santee Sioux Reservation in the northeastern corner of Nebraska, close to the South Dakota border, where his father worked whatever jobs he could find to feed a large family. Then, when John was just 6 years old, his mother died. The loss shattered the family in ways he would spend decades trying to articulate. He watched his father break himself, working double shifts for wages that barely covered groceries, and even as a child, something about the arrangement struck him as fundamentally wrong. Years later, he would say that watching his father's exhaustion gave him a deep contempt for the American work ethic. Not because his father was lazy, but because the system was designed to consume men like him and discard what was left. School offered no rescue. He would later say simply that high school was not good for him. But music was. Between the ages of 9 and 12, rock and roll reached the reservation, and something in its rebellion spoke directly to the boy who already understood that the rules hadn't been written for people who looked like him. But could a kid from a broken family on a forgotten reservation ever find a stage big enough to be heard? Number 2. Escape by sea. In 1963, at just 17 years old, John Trudell dropped out of high school and enlisted in the United States Navy. He wasn't running toward patriotism. He was running away from a life that was closing in on him. He needed, as he put it, to get away from where he was at, and the military was the only door that was open. The Navy stationed him on a destroyer, conducting search and rescue operations off the coast of Vietnam, pulling down American pilots from the South China Sea. He completed 2 full Western Pacific tours between 1963 and 1967, spending months at a time watching the machinery of war up close. What he saw changed him. He watched how the military treated Asian civilians and how it treated its own minority servicemen differently from white troops, and his Santee Dakota blood made him see the pattern with devastating clarity. This wasn't new. This was the same system that had taken his people's land, just wearing a different uniform in a different century. When he was discharged in 1967, he landed in Southern California and enrolled at San Bernardino Valley College to study radio broadcasting. It seemed like a modest choice for a quiet young veteran, but the skill he learned behind those practice microphones would soon make him the most recognizable indigenous voice in America. The question was whether anyone beyond a college classroom would ever hear it. Number 3. The Voice of Alcatraz. On November 20th, 1969, a group of Native American activists, calling themselves the Indians of All Tribes, did something that stunned the nation. They occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, claiming the abandoned federal prison under an 1868 Sioux Treaty that granted Native people the right to unused federal land. John Trudell arrived about a week after the occupation began, and within days, everything changed. Drawing on his broadcasting training, Trudell launched a radio program called Radio Free Alcatraz on December 22, 1969. The show aired on weekday evenings at 7:15 Pacific Time, carried live by the Pacifica Network through stations in Berkeley, Los Angeles, and New York. Each broadcast opened with Buffy St. Marie singing "Now That the Buffalo's Gone," and then Trudell's voice would fill the airwaves, talking about fishing rights that had been stolen, cultural traditions that had been suppressed, and reservation conditions that most Americans had never seen and didn't want to know about. The Pacifica Radio archives still hold 39 recorded episodes from those broadcasts. Trudell became the occupation's national spokesman, the face and voice that mainstream media turned to when they needed someone who could articulate indigenous rage in language that white America couldn't dismiss. And on that rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, something deeply personal happened too. His son, whom he named Wovoka after the Paiute prophet, was born on Alcatraz during the occupation. The island that the government considered a symbol of punishment became the birthplace of his child. The occupation lasted 19 months, ending on June 11, 1971, when federal marshals removed the last 15 occupiers. Trudell walked off the island, but the island never left him. What would he do with the voice that millions had now heard? Number 4. Chairman of a movement under siege. After Alcatraz, Trudell didn't retreat to private life. He joined the American Indian movement, and by 1973 had risen to national chairman, making him the most visible indigenous leader in the country, and the man with the biggest target on his back. He led the way a street fighter leads, from the front. In November 1972, he helped organize the Trail of Broken Treaties, a massive cross-country caravan that converged on Washington, D.C. When bureaucrats refused to meet with the marchers, Trudell and the others occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building for 71 hours, barricading the doors with office furniture and presenting a 20-point manifesto demanding that the government honor its own treaties. The government responded by sending police. 3 months later came the siege that nearly killed him. At Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the same ground where the U.S. Army had massacred nearly 300 Lakota in 1890, AIM members and Oglala Lakota residents seized the town in February 1973. Federal marshals, FBI agents, and armored personnel carriers surrounded the village. The standoff lasted 71 days. 2 Native Americans were killed. A federal marshal was paralyzed. Trudell moved in and out of the perimeter at enormous personal risk, acting as the voice that explained to the outside world why these people were willing to die on the same dirt where their ancestors had been slaughtered 83 years earlier. But the moment that best captured who John Trudell really was happened in 1975 at the Duck Valley Trading Post. Reservation elders were going hungry because the post charged prices they couldn't afford. Trudell walked in with a pistol, fired a single round into the wall, and demanded lower food prices. The bullet passed clean through a can of Hawaiian Punch, which the FBI later recovered and forensically examined as evidence for an assault with a deadly weapon charge. 17,000 pages of surveillance on the most eloquent man in the movement, and the physical evidence they built their case around was a can of fruit drink with a hole in it. Was the government trying to prosecute a crime or trying to silence a voice? Number 5. 17,000 pages of fear. The answer could be found in the filing cabinets of the J. Edgar Hoover Building. By the mid-1970s, the FBI had compiled a surveillance dossier on John Trudell that would eventually reach an estimated 17,000 pages, making it one of the largest files the Bureau had ever assembled on a single American citizen. Agents followed him across state lines. They tapped his phones. They photographed his meetings. They infiltrated his inner circle with informants, and buried in those thousands of pages was the assessment that would define him for the rest of his life. An FBI memo described Trudell as extremely eloquent, and therefore extremely dangerous. Not armed and dangerous, not violent and dangerous, eloquent and dangerous. The Bureau didn't stop at surveillance. Declassified documents revealed years later that the FBI considered charging Trudell under 2 rarely invoked federal statutes: insurrection or rebellion, and seditious conspiracy, laws that carried penalties of up to 20 years in prison and permanent disqualification from holding any office under the United States. One internal FBI assessment noted that Trudell had the ability to meet with a group of pacifists and in a short time have them yelling and screaming. Trudell himself responded with dark humor. 17,000 pages, he told a reporter in 1992. That's a lot of trees to assassinate to spy on someone. But could even humor protect him from what the government might do next? Number 6. The flag on the steps. On February 11, 1979, John Trudell stood on the steps of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., looked directly at the building that housed those 17,000 pages, and struck a match. He burned an American flag while federal agents watched through the windows above him. It was not a random act of defiance. Trudell framed it with the precision of a man who had been studying his enemy for a decade. He reminded the agents watching that the United States military had taught him that when a flag is desecrated, the proper protocol is to burn it. And then he told them that injustice and racism and classism and their whole way of life had desecrated whatever they said that flag was supposed to mean. He was poking the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world directly in the eye, in their own front yard, with cameras rolling. He knew the Bureau had been tracking his every move for years. He knew they considered him dangerous, and he burned that flag anyway. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that in fewer than 12 hours, his entire world would be destroyed, and the fire that would take everything from him would not be one he had set himself. Number 7. 12 hours. In the early morning hours of February 12, 1979, roughly 12 hours after John Trudell burned that flag on the steps of FBI headquarters, a fire erupted at the home of Arthur Manning on the Duck Valley Reservation along the Nevada-Idaho border. Inside the house were Trudell's wife, 29-year-old Tina Manning Trudell, a Shoshone Paiute woman who had been fighting for tribal water rights against local ranchers and Bureau of Indian Affairs officials. Also inside were their 3 children, 5-year-old Ricarda Starr, 3-year-old Sunshine Karma, and 1-year-old Eli Changing Sun. Tina was pregnant with their 4th child, a boy they planned to name Josiah Hawk. Tina's mother, Leah Hicks Manning, who coordinated social services on the reservation, was there too. All of them died in that fire. Arthur Manning was the only survivor. The Bureau of Indian Affairs investigated and ruled the fire accidental, but the details didn't add up. One investigation noted that the fire appeared to have started on the roof, an extremely unlikely and suspicious origin point for an accidental house fire. Trudell hired a private investigator and arson specialist who reportedly found the official explanation practically impossible. Congressman Ronald Dellums of California wrote to FBI Director William Webster demanding a thorough investigation of the suspicious circumstances. The FBI declined, deferring to the BIA's accidental finding. No one was ever charged. No one was ever investigated beyond the initial ruling. Trudell said flatly that it was murder, that they were murdered as an act of war. But he also insisted that Tina not be defined solely through her relationship to him. For anyone to think that what happened to her happened as specifically something just related to me, he said, that minimizes who she is. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting for water rights that threatened powerful interests on that reservation long before John Trudell ever set foot on those FBI steps. Trudell resigned the AIM chairmanship. He dismantled the national organization, concluding that it had become nothing more than a list of pre-selected targets. At 33 years old, he had lost his wife, his children, his unborn son, and his mother-in-law in a single night. But what he did with that grief would stun everyone who thought the fire had finally silenced him. Number 8. Lines from a Mined Mind. About 6 months after the fire, something unexpected happened. John Trudell, the man of action, the street organizer, the bullhorn revolutionary, began to write. He had never been the poet in the family. That had been Tina. But now, sitting alone with a grief so enormous it threatened to swallow him whole, lines began arriving in his head as if they were being given to him from somewhere beyond himself. He described what happened in terms that sounded less like craft and more like survival. The lines were my bombs, my explosions, my tears, he said. They were my everything. He credited Tina's spirit with giving him the lines to follow so he wouldn't fall completely. In 1979, he met Jackson Browne, who recognized something extraordinary in this grieving activist and opened the door to the recording world. On May Day 1985, he met Kiowa guitarist Jesse Ed Davis, who listened to Trudell's words and said simply, "I can make music for your words." Together they created AKA Graffiti Man, released in 1986 as a self-produced cassette on Trudell's own Peace Company label. Spoken word, layered over rock and blues guitar. It sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard before. A copy made its way to Bob Dylan, who told Rolling Stone that AKA Graffiti Man was the best album of 1986, and that only people like Lou Reed and John Doe could dream about doing work like this. Dylan played it over the PA system during his 1987 tour. The Grateful Dead played it during intermissions at their summer concerts. The man the FBI had called the most dangerous voice in the movement had released his masterpiece on a homemade cassette, and the greatest songwriter of the 20th century declared it the best thing he had heard all year. But could the same voice that conquered the music world also conquer Hollywood? Number 9. From the Reservation to the Screen. The answer came in 1992, when director Michael Apted cast Trudell as Jimmy Looks Twice in the film Thunderheart, a thriller set on a fictional version of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Trudell played an AIM-style activist suspected by the FBI, essentially performing a version of his own life opposite Val Kilmer and Sam Shepard. He had no formal acting training. He didn't need it. Robert Redford, who produced the companion documentary Incident at Oglala about the Leonard Peltier case, said there wasn't an untruthful moment in his performance. In 1998, Trudell appeared in Smoke Signals, the landmark film written by Sherman Alexie and directed by Chris Eyre, the first feature film written, directed, and co-produced entirely by Native Americans to receive wide theatrical distribution. Trudell played Randy Peony, the radio DJ on the fictional station K-Rez, a quiet callback to his radio-free Alcatraz days nearly 3 decades earlier. But his most unexpected alliance came off-screen. Trudell became close with Marceline Bertrand, the actress and humanitarian who was Angelina Jolie's mother. Bertrand became Trudell's partner, and together they co-founded the All Tribes Foundation, which by 2007 had issued over $800,000 in grants to reservation programs across the country. Angelina Jolie herself executive produced Trudell's 2001 album Bone Days and helped finance the feature documentary about his life. When asked about her, Trudell said she gave him the money to do it and called her one of the most intelligent people he had ever met. Chris Christopherson wrote a tribute song called Johnny Lobo and described Trudell as a crazy lone wolf, poet, prophet, preacher, warrior. Bonnie Raitt called him probably the most charismatic speaker she had ever heard. The dropout, the veteran, the fugitive, the grieving father had somehow become a man that Hollywood's biggest names competed to celebrate. But what was the message he had been carrying all along? Number 10. My Ride Showed Up. The message was deceptively simple. John Trudell spent his final years trying to get people to understand a single idea. When Columbus got off the boat, Trudell would say, "He asked us who we were. We said we're the human beings, we're the people." The Europeans didn't understand that. They couldn't understand it, because the system they brought with them had already taught them to think of themselves not as human beings, but as citizens, as consumers, as categories to be managed. He called the modern world a mining operation, and he wasn't talking about gold or copper. He meant the mining of human intelligence and spirit, the extraction of everything that made people alive and its conversion into obedience and productivity. That was the central metaphor of his 2008 book, Lines from a Mined Mind, which collected 25 years of his poetry and prose. As human beings, he wrote, it is time to take responsibility for the power of our intelligence. This isn't about whether we can or we cannot. This is about whether we will or we won't. He refused every label. I'm not really a poet or a writer or an actor or an activist, he said. I'm me, and these are things that I do. The documentary that Heather Ray spent 13 years filming, which premiered at Sundance in January 2005 and won Best Documentary at the American Indian Film Festival, couldn't fully capture a man who considered categories themselves a form of colonization. In early December 2015, word spread that Trudell was in the final stages of terminal cancer. His death was prematurely reported on December 4th, and his publicist had to issue a correction. He was still alive. He held on 4 more days. On December 8, 2015, at his home in Santa Clara County, California, surrounded by family and friends, John Trudell died at the age of 69. Among his final words was a thank you for the love that had been shown to him, which he said was like a fire to my heart. A family member posted a message to his Facebook page that captured everything he had ever believed about the difference between existing and being alive. The message read simply, "My ride showed up. Celebrate love, celebrate life." The FBI had called him extremely eloquent, therefore extremely dangerous. They had spent decades and 17,000 pages trying to understand what made this soft-spoken Santee Dakota man from a broken family in Nebraska so impossible to contain. But they were asking the wrong question. They kept trying to figure out what made John Trudell dangerous. They never understood that what made him dangerous was that he remembered what it meant to be a human being, and he spent every day of his life trying to get the rest of us to remember too. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and join us next time when we uncover another legend that Hollywood and history tried to forget.